Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you with us, and hopefully, you have a nice hot cup of coffee or a cold cup of coffee with you and ready to learn what I hope will be a lot of great information. Before we get started, I do want to take care of a couple of housekeeping items. First, it's really important to us that you have an opportunity to ask questions. So make sure to use the question function on your computer to be able to do that. And I should also note that we have our fabulous intern, Elise Hopes, with us today to help moderate the Q&A portion, which is dispersed throughout the webinar as well. And so let me also introduce myself as well. I'm Lana Rux, Principal Consultant of the Rux Group. And the Rux Group is a research and evaluation firm that gathers, analyzes, and interprets data to enable our clients to measure the impact of their work. We were formed in 2008, and over the past several years, we've had the privilege with working with a number of clients, primarily in higher education, and grants funded by federal agencies such as the National Science Foundation, Department of Education, and Department of Labor, as well as projects funded by foundations such as the Gates Foundation and the Kresge Foundation. So if you're on this call, you may have some familiarity with the concept of evaluation, but even still, I think there's a lot of utility and benefit of providing a definition, because there's a lot of different ways that people think of what evaluation is. So the definition that I gravitate to is this one, and that is evaluation is the use of social science methods to systematically investigate the effectiveness of social intervention programs. Now, because evaluation comes out of a research tradition, you can kind of understand why there's a lot of different terms, concepts, words that are kind of difficult in terms of understanding what they mean, let alone really understanding where they actually apply and where they are applicable. And so that makes it very challenging when trying to write an evaluation plan for grant proposals, particularly when evaluation has kind of increased in its importance within the grant funding space. So that's why there are a couple of purposes throughout this webinar series that I want to accomplish. First, I want to be able to organize evaluation terms around the framework, help you to understand conceptually where each term falls, and then using that to be able to provide a formula for actually writing evaluation plans. Taking that together, hopefully the other piece that we'll be able to do is just reduce some of the evaluation angst. So instead of seeing some evaluation as a nuisance and something that you have to do that's actually in the way of the project, being able to reduce that evaluation angst so you can see the value of evaluation and how it actually helps you to achieve your goals. And then finally, of course, like I mentioned, we want to make sure that we're able to answer your questions. So let me start by talking about the organizing framework and the organizing framework for an evaluation plan. And this is how I think about these elements of evaluation. So the first two pieces, I think of those as the foundation. And that's where we're talking about the theory of change and the evaluation questions. And that's really the purpose of today's webinar. The next two I think of as the methods. That's the evaluation design, data gathering, and analysis. And that's going to be what we will review in 2 weeks. And the final piece will be the finale, the use of evaluation findings, and the operational approach. So one of the things that you may be thinking, again, if you've been in this space with evaluations, that, wait a minute, Lana, I like the concept of things just kind of falling within 6 elements, but is that really true? Because it feels like there's this real kind of variation if I'm working with a small grant versus a large grant, and it gets really confusing in regards to what I should put in and what I shouldn't put in. And that's a completely legitimate point. So the way that I want you to think about this is think about this like an accordion. And think about that if you're doing or working with a small grant, a small scale, you push in the elements, and we'll talk about how to do that so that for a small scale, for each of those 6 different components, you may just include a sentence. So the resulting evaluation plan may just be a paragraph. Or for a large scale, you may kind of pull out and you'll have more detail in certain elements. So you're talking about it with several sentences or a paragraph, and you're adding much more detail. So fundamentally, for the evaluation plan, we're still just talking about 6 elements, but what's going to vary will be the amount of detail. And I did want to provide at least way I think about assessing scale, so at least you can understand what I mean when I say small or moderate or large scale, because scale is really relative. It kind of depends on what projects that you're used to working with or used to working on. So when I say small, what I'm saying is that the funding amount is about $130,000 per year. And that in that evaluation plan, typically there are limited words for the evaluation. So there's not a lot of space for that. When you start getting to moderate, it's somewhere between 150 to $1 million in terms of funding per year. And there may be more explicit requirements for the external evaluator or around the evaluation. And you're given more space to actually describe what you're going to do with the evaluation. And then for a large scale, we're talking about a funding amount of maybe $1 million or more and more kind of detailed. Again, you may have a different definition of small, moderate, and large, but at least you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about when I'm referring to scale. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about the first concept, that of theory of change. Right. So when we're talking about theory of change, what is it that we're talking about? Well, one way to think about it, it's the general expected outcomes of an initiative. The other part of that definition that I really like is that it's the project's hypothesis or what outcomes will be achieved and how. So one way to think about theory of change is in a very simplistic standpoint of what you're going to do and what are you going to get, right? So what will you do and what will you get? So essentially what you're saying is, if we do this, then we will get, etc., that. And so the first step in terms of formula is that you want to be able to summarize the theory of change in a sentence. You want to be able to condense down what you're thinking about the project and really being able to have a sentence around that theory of change. So let me walk you through a couple of examples and show you what that looks like. So in this first example, this is a Department of Ed project that we are working on. It's funded through the Undergraduate International Studies and Foreign Language Program. And the project's theory of change basically asserts that if the Global Studies program at this particular college is created, then students will be better able to think critically about pressing global challenges and better prepared for postgraduate or a professional career. So we have our if portion and then our then portion. Here's another example. Again, this is a Department of Ed Minority Science and Engineering Improvement Grant that we would consider a moderate-sized grant. And in this project, the project is kind of posits that if early academic assistance through professional and premier mentoring supported by networks that remove non-academic barriers are provided, then there will be increased student performance, graduation, and STEM workforce rates. And so let me wrap this portion up with an example from a large scale. And this is the DOE TACT grant that many community colleges were participating in. And in this theory of change, we wrote it this way. The theory of change undergirding this project is that if TAA eligible workers, veterans, and other workers are provided an opportunity to quickly advance their credentials, in a field with job openings, in this case, as a mechatronics technician or industrial machinery mechanic, then participants will increase their earnings and employability. So you can see that in 3 different types of examples with 3 different really types of potential complexity, that there was this attempt to really be able to distill what the project is doing down to a sentence. And that's the first piece of the formula in terms of writing an evaluation plan. So let me pause there for a moment and ask Elise, are there any questions that have been posed?
Yes. What if you can't summarize the project in a sentence?
That's a really good question. So if there's a challenge in terms of being able to condense down the project in a sentence, I often think that may cue that there may be more distillation of the project, more clarity around the understanding what the doing part is and the then part afterwards. It reminds me of, I was working with a project team a couple of months ago in a project narrative, and was going through the draft, draft of the proposal, and I was having a really hard time drafting out what that theory of change was in a sentence, and got on the phone with the PI and had some additional kind of clarifying questions. And when he shared with me what the then was, I was like, oh wow, that's really cool. That's really reflected in what the narrative is. So making sure to go back and pepper that into the narrative. And so that's, sometimes if you can't get it down to a sentence, it really kind of cues that there may be something kind of challenging that you may want to address. Okay. Were there any other questions?
Yes. When you're talking about funding, is this funding for the evaluation or for the project itself?
When I'm talking about that amount per year, I'm talking about the entire, for the project overall. So I'm not talking, so when I say $100,000 a year, I'm talking about overall for the project, not what's allocated for the evaluation. Right.
Thank you, Lana. That's all the questions at the moment.
Okay, perfect. Let's go ahead and go on to the next portion. And the next portion is in regards to logic models. And again, if you've been in this space for a period of time, you're very familiar with the idea of a logic model, and you probably have come across that before. And so one of the reasons why I don't include this as a separate element is because the way I think about logic models is that it's really just a part of theory of change. And indeed, that's actually how I think about it in terms of the definition. Just thinking about it as a pictorial representation of theory of change, but it's going to have a lot more detail. So thinking about the if and then, the do and the get, and now pulling that out more, and that's how we start to build the logic model. So let me give you a template, and then I'll walk through a couple of examples as well. So in a logic model, there are 6 elements, generally 6 elements. And they're around the inputs, which are about the resources that are needed to perform activities, what those actual planned activities are, and then the related outputs with that. And conceptually, again, if you want to kind of map onto that sentence that we've developed, that sentence maps onto that if part, that beginning part of that sentence, or the doing part. And then the other part would be the getting, or the then part. And that's when you're starting to get into your outcomes. And your outcomes are going to be short-term, intermediate, or long-term. And I should note that within this is that the amount of time or the scale in which you're looking at the time frame really has to do with the time length of the project. We just typically work with a lot of projects that are about 3 years in length, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. And so that's why in terms of developing this template. That's why it's at 3 years. But sometimes you have a grant that's a year long, or sometimes you have a grant that's 5 years. So you want to adjust that piece, that time frame, or thinking about your short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes in regards to the length of time of the grant. So in thinking about that, still with step 1, still thinking about the theory of change, at the proposal stage, try to include a logic model for moderate and large grants. The reason why you definitely can include that for smaller grants, just trying to reduce out the amount of complexity around the evaluation plan, and because you may have limited space with that proposal, it's okay if you have a smaller grant that you're seeking funding for and you don't have a logic model at the proposal stage. I do think that if you get the grant, that there's a lot of benefit of having the logic model, so you would want to develop it at that point, but just thinking about how can you simplify this process. So if it's a moderate large grant, try to make sure to have a logic model at that point. And so let me give you a couple of examples. Again, going back to this this grant that was provided by the Department of Ed. This is a moderate scale. And as you can see, you have the inputs associated with the project, what they have in terms of the mentors, advisors, the tutors, the equipment that's needed, and as well as they highlight the funding, the activities that are going to be planned, what they're expecting to do, and then the outputs, what they're actually looking at tied to those specific activities. And then you start seeing the outcomes, which are things that aren't necessarily under their direct control, but what they're expecting based on what they're doing with their activities and their outputs. So things like confidence, the self-efficacy increase, mindset increase, as well as retention, persistence increasing, and ultimately that long-term goal of increasing the number of graduates who are pursuing either a STEM-related job or who are going on to a professional school. Here's another example again with the Department of Labor. This logic model looks a little bit different. In this situation, we included in the context. We added some information about the context. And then that context was kind of leading to what those inputs are. So very similar in regards to what was needed to be able to get the whole process going, what would be needed to get the initiative off the ground. And then what were the kind of planned activities associated with that. And then what was expected in terms of the outputs, and the outputs with recruiting individuals and they're completing the number of certificates, things of that nature. And then what some of those outcomes are, short term, and then the long-term outcomes. So even though these look very different, the key information still in the logic model. I do want to make a little note because I see this emerge often where if you think about what the funder's language is, it may be a little bit different than what the evaluation language is, and that could be confusing. So again, like what we're talking about outputs, we're talking about the actual number counts and what's actually directly tied to the activity. And sometimes that funder, for a number of reasons, may call that an outcome. And so if you are encountering those types of situations, one of the things I think is important and it's helpful is to really think about the definition in its broad terms and what that means at the conceptual level and what the vendor is asking in terms of at a broad point, and then kind of working back to what term they're using for that. I think if you use that strategy and that approach, that will be really helpful in terms of trying to align what would be kind of quote unquote traditional value language with what the funder's language is, right? So the take-home lesson from that portion is really around that a logic model that summarizes the theory of change is encouraged when you're working with a moderate and large scale evaluations. So I'm going to pause there for a moment and check in with Elise to see if there are any other questions.
Yes, there are several. The first is, if you can't include the logic model in the proposal package, is there still utility in completing it?
I think there is. I think there's utility, even if it can't, because one of the challenges, and that's why, again, I was saying with a small scale, and this happens sometimes with a moderate scale, there's a spacing issue in terms of getting the logic model actually into the proposal. And so that sometimes teams that are working on proposals will run into that. But where I find the utility, and I'm thinking about two examples in particular, one actually earlier today when I was working with another individual on a project team, on a logic model, what it brings up are your assumptions and the kind of varied assumptions among the team members about the project. And it will bring up some issues in terms of conceptualization, so that even if you can't technically get the logic model in the proposal, the ideas, thoughts that emerge from the logic model are reflected because the narrative itself gets tighter. So I do think there's benefit, and sometimes things are just going really fast, though, that it's not done. So I understand if it doesn't get done, but at its best, I think it's really a lot of benefit to getting that logic model completed at the beginning, and then definitely, if it's awarded, just getting some clarification on what the project is and things of that nature. So did you say there was another question, Elise?
Yes. As the evaluator, do you generate the logic model, or do you expect the client, the grant recipient, to do so?
It's a good question. So it depends. I work with a lot of project teams that will develop initial draft, and I will get feedback on that. I work with project teams where I'm actually developing a finalized version of the logic model, and just kind of going through and kind of gleaning from the proposal what elements fit in terms of the activities and the outputs and things of that nature, and we'll review that. And because sometimes, if you're working on a proposal, you're flying the plane and building at the same time, it's going to go quickly. Sometimes there's not the opportunity to create a formal logic model. So I almost always have an informal logic model that I've drafted out, and that has some elements of that, because that helps me to be able to pinpoint what needs to be evaluated. So it's nice if the project team can start that process, because sometimes, depending on when you actually are engaging with the evaluator, it's hard to get it in a finalized place. Or if you start with an evaluator much earlier, that person probably will have enough time to get it finalized. But ultimately, there should be some back and forth between the evaluator and the project team in terms of finalizing out what that logic model looks like. All right, well, let's go ahead and turn to evaluation questions. So one of the things I want you to keep in mind is that evaluation uses many of the same conventions as research. And actually, if you go back to one of the webinars that we held in the spring, I go a little bit more in detail around this. But what I really want to highlight at this point is that, just like in research, when you develop research questions, there are questions that are developed within evaluation. So in thinking about step 2 in articulating evaluation questions, what you're varying will not be the presence or absence of the evaluation questions. What you're actually varying will be the number, because you always have some sort of question. The difference is whether that question is explicit or not. And so you want to make sure that you're making your evaluation questions explicit, even if they're just a small number of them. So let's kind of go back to some of the examples that we've been following throughout this webinar. So for the Department of Education grant, the small grant, again, we had the theory of change presented with that if-then kind of conceptualization. And in this situation, we only have 3 evaluation questions. And this is what they are. So one was related to the implementation or formative evaluation. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then the other questions were more centered around the outcomes of the project. Similarly, with the other Department of Ed project with that improvement grant, that moderate scale, again, you can see the theory of change, and it's presented in a sentence. And in this situation, we had 5 evaluation questions. Again, one on formative evaluation, and then the other is more focused on summative evaluation. And then with the large TACT grant, in this situation, we had 20 evaluation questions. So I present 10 of those. The intention is not for you to read all of them, but really what I just want to drive home the point of is that what's going to vary in terms of the size with evaluation questions will be the number, not the presence or absence of those evaluation questions. If you go to our recording, you'll be able to obtain these thought prompt questions, and I provide a couple of thought prompt questions around formative evaluation. So you've probably heard that word before, and basically formative evaluation relates to the if part, if we do this, and there's some thought prompts with that. And then summative evaluation relates to the then we will get this. And some, again, thought prompts related to that. So really the take-home lesson here is that just make sure you're scaling the number of evaluation questions for the size of the grant. So let me go ahead and pause there. And Elise, are there any questions?
Yes. What should you do if you have a small grant and a lot of evaluation questions?
Good question. I think that it's really useful if you have a lot of questions to really challenge yourself to really focus in on what you really want to learn. What I get concerned about, if you have a small grant, you don't necessarily have a lot of resources associated with that. And so if you start to include a lot of questions, you may introduce complexity that doesn't necessarily need to be there. So really challenge yourself to think about, what do you really want to learn? What would really be beneficial in regards to the next iteration of this project? What would be beneficial to know about the next iteration? And just try to narrow down the number of questions that you have to something that's much more manageable for the resources that you have. Okay. Is there another question?
Yes. Which is better, an in-house evaluation or an external professional?
Another good question. So I'm going to step back from that question for a moment and just say I'm not sure that it's an issue of internal or external. I think what you really want to make sure that you have is an evaluation champion. Someone who's not just there in name only, but someone who is really there to drive the evaluation process. So, for instance, for a lot of the work that we do, we are working with innovative new initiatives, and so we implement what's called developmental evaluation. And so it's really important for us to stay close on projects to be able to effectively implement that evaluation. And I think in that type of situation, it's really important, whether they're internal or external, you have someone on the team who's staying close on the project so that as you're having to make changes around the initiative, they are close on the project to be able to make adjustments in the evaluation and to know, oh, this is a really good time to collect data. We need to understand this piece or to make some adjustments in the project. So if you have individuals who really can serve as that champion, someone who can really tell the story of what the initiative is doing, I think that's the type of person that you want to have on your team. So I'm going to actually have to stop there because we're at time. So just a couple of items. You're going to receive in your email tomorrow a survey about this webinar because I'm an evaluator. So it's, of course, I want to get your feedback for continuous improvement about your experience. So please complete that. And then you'll also receive a link to the recording. So complete that as well. And I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks where we will move to the next two elements on the methods. And so thank you so much for coming today and have a great day. And I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Thank you.